Sedentary women who start briskly walking on a treadmill 45 minutes a day for a few months may cut their risk of upper respiratory tract infections in half. But how does exercise improve our immune system? Approximately 95% of all infections are initiated at the mucosal surfaces, the moist surfaces like our eyes, nose, and mouth, that are protected by antibodies like IgA, which provides an immunological barrier by neutralizing and preventing viral pathogens from penetrating the body. The IgA in our saliva, for example, is the first line of defense against respiratory tract infections such as pneumonia and influenza. And moderate aerobic exercise, even just 30 minutes in the gym 3 times a week, may be all it takes to significantly boost IgA levels, and significantly decrease the risk of coming down with flu-like symptoms. But we've known for a long time that prolonged, heavy exercise may reduce resistance to infectious disease, manifesting by an apparent 2 to 6-fold increase in upper respiratory tract infection symptoms for several weeks following marathon running. Even just a single bout of overstrenuous exercise may drop IgA levels. Within a day of starting an international competition, for example, elite soccer players suffered a significant drop in IgA secretion. Yacht racing athletes training for America's Cup who got upper respiratory tract infections during training had significantly lower IgA concentrations. Those with higher levels had fewer infections, and if you measure over time, you can see dropping levels precede the infection. Furthermore, a simple fatigue rating appears to reflect changes in salivary immunity. If you just ask them, how rested do you feel? Those reported feeling worse than normal had significantly lower IgA levels. Sport coaches are advised to monitor immune function since illness could ultimately lead to a decrease in performance. Therefore, it may be necessary to take protective actions to, for example, minimize contact with cold viruses. But the reason athletes can't get away with just washing their hands and wearing a mask is because upper respiratory tract infections are often triggered by reactivations of latent viruses already inside our bodies, like Epstein-Barr virus, EBV, and as soon as our immune function dips, the virus becomes reactivated. IgA levels drop the day before EBV comes out of hiding and causes a spike in symptoms. These results suggest that the appearance of upper respiratory symptoms is associated with reactivation of EBV and reduction of salivary IgA during training. So how are we going to preserve immunity in athletes? Well, I talked about the efficacy of using a one-celled fungi, nutritional yeast, to boost the immune system of athletes. What about a one-celled plant? Researchers out of Japan found IgA concentrations in breast milk could be increased by giving mothers chlorella, a unicellular freshwater green algae sold as powder or compressed into tablets. What about other parts of the body? 30 tablets of chlorella a day for a month increased IgA secretion in the mouth as well. But does that actually help in a clinically meaningful way? Researchers in Canada tried to see if they could boost the efficacy of flu shots, but a chlorella-derived dietary supplement did not appear to have any effect. They were using some purified extract of chlorella, though not the real thing. What about giving chlorella to athletes during training camp? High-intensity physical activity, group living, ripe for infection. And indeed, the training was so intense, IgA levels significantly dropped, but not in those given chlorella each day. So chlorella intake may attenuate the reduced IgA secretion during athletic training. Public health workers tend to each work in their own separate domains. The tobacco folks rarely talk to the alcohol folks, nutrition or sexual health folks, with little apparent recognition that, far from being unique and separate, the behaviors they all address may comprise a typical Saturday night out for a large sector of the population. This blinds us to the importance of individual empowerment. We beetle away at micromanaging specific behaviors and ignore the key message emerging from the public health evidence base that, for the first time in human history, we now know how we can take a measure of control over our own health and longevity. So much control, as I've previously addressed, that we may be able to effectively turn back the clock 14 years in terms of mortality. But whether the benefits observed in these studies are the result of lifelong good health habits, or can be achieved by people who make changes later in life, needs to be confirmed. And it was. People who newly adopt a healthy lifestyle in middle age appear to experience a prompt benefit of lower rates of cardiovascular disease and mortality. In this study, they found that a midlife switch, late 40s or 50s or early 60s, to a healthy lifestyle that included the diet of at least 5 servings of fruits and vegetables, exercise, maintaining a healthy weight, and not smoking, results in a substantial reduction in mortality over just the subsequent 4 years. Surprising, first, because the benefit appeared so quickly, and second, because the lifestyle changes were so modest. The findings emphasize that making the necessary lifestyle changes is extremely worthwhile, and it's never too late to get with the program. If we can get such dramatic benefits so late in life in such a short amount of time, why can't we just live lives of gluttony and sloth, and then around 50 or so just clean up our acts? Because it may be too late. Our first symptom may be our last: sudden cardiac death. Sudden cardiac death accounts for more than half of all heart disease deaths. Hundreds of thousands of Americans just drop dead every year. Sudden cardiac death is the first manifestation of heart disease for the majority of individuals, particularly among women, meaning they had no idea they even had heart disease until they were literally dying from it. For many, their first indication of the presence of coronary heart disease is their demise. That's why prevention is the key. So does prevention work? Women who don't smoke, walk a half hour a day, eat a prudent diet, defined here, for example, as greater than average intake of fruit, vegetable, nut, whole grain, and bean consumption, and who aren't overweight, had a 92% lower risk of sudden cardiac death. When it comes to sudden death, an ounce of prevention is truly worth more than a pound of cure, because there is no cure for dead. The human gut has a diverse collection of microorganisms making up some 1,000 species, with each individual presenting with their own unique collection. But it wasn't known whether this variation is on a continuum, or if people cluster into specific classifiable types, until this famous study analyzed the gut flora of people across multiple countries and continents, and identified 3 so-called enterotypes. There were people who had lots of Bacteroides in their gut, people who had a predominance of Prevotella species, and people whose stool instead grew out of a lot of Ruminococcus species. Pretty amazing that with so many hundreds of types of bacteria, that people would settle into just one of 3 categories. But they figure our guts are like ecosystems. Just like there's lots of different species of animals on the planet, they aren't randomly distributed. I mean, you don't find dolphins in the desert. In the desert, you find desert species. In the jungle, you find jungle species, because each ecosystem has different selective pressures, like rainfall or temperature. Well, this early research suggests that there are 3 types of colon ecosystems. You can split humanity up into 3 types: people whose guts grow out lots of Bacteroides-type bacteria, those whose guts are better homes for Prevotella group bacteria, and those that foster the growth of Ruminococcus. And if you think it's amazing they were able to boil it down to fit everyone into just one of 3 groups, subsequent research on a much larger sample of people was able to fold Ruminococcus into Bacteroides. So now everyone fits into just one of 2 groups. So now we know, when it comes to gut flora, there are just 2 types of people in the world. those that grow up mostly Bacteroides, and those that overwhelmingly are home to Prevotella species. The question is why? It didn't seem to matter where you lived, male or female, how old or skinny you are. What matters is what you eat. And this is what's called a heat map. Each column is a different grouping of bacteria, and each row is a food component. Red is like hot, meaning a close correlation between the presence of this particular bacteria and lots of that particular nutrient in the diet. Blue is like cold, meaning you're way off. A reverse correlation, meaning lots of that nutrient is correlated with very low levels of that bacteria in our gut. They looked at over 100 different food components, and a theme started to arise. This column is Bacteroides, and this column is Prevotella. Note how they're kind of opposites. When it comes to things like animal fat, cholesterol, animal protein, Bacteroides is red, and Prevotella is blue. When it comes to plant components like carbohydrates, Prevotella is red, and Bacteroides is blue. Here's a simplified version, clearly showing the components found more in animal foods like protein and fat are associated with Bacteroides, with the Bacteroides enterotype, and those found almost exclusively in plant foods are associated with Prevotella. So no surprise African Americans fell into the Bacteroides enterotype, where most of the native Africans were Prevotella. The reason this may matter is that Bacteroides species are generally associated with increased risk of colon cancer, our second leading cause of cancer death, yet almost unheard of among native Africans. The differences in our gut flora may help explain why Americans appear to have more than 50 times the rate of colon cancer. If whatever gut flora enterotype we are could play an important role in our risk of developing chronic diet-associated diseases, the next question is, can we alter our gut microbiome by altering our diet? And the answer is, diet can rapidly and reproducibly alter the bacteria in our gut. There's been growing concern that recent lifestyle innovations, most notably the high-fat, high-sugar Western diet, have altered the composition and activity of our resident gut flora. Such diet-induced changes to gut-associated microbial communities are now suspected of contributing to growing epidemics of chronic disease in the developed world. Yet it remained unclear how quickly our gut bacteria could respond to dietary change. So they prepared two diets, a plant-based diet, rich in grains, beans, fruits, and vegetables, and an animal-based diet, which was composed of meats, eggs, and cheeses. No refined sugars in either. They just wanted to test plant versus animal. And within just 1 day of the animal-based diet hitting the gut, there was a significant shift. For example, the lifelong vegetarian. What happens when you put him on an animal-based diet? Well, he started out Prevotella, like the one vegan in the typing study, but unlike everyone else, because they were eating a more standard American diet. Remarkably, the animal-based diet inverted the vegetarian's Prevotella to Bacteroides ratio, causing the Bacteroides to outnumber the Prevotella within just 4 days on an animal-based diet. His entire gut flora got turned on its head. The fact that our gut can so rapidly switch between herbivorous and carnivorous functional profiles is probably a good thing, evolution-wise. I mean, if you bring down a mammoth and you're eating meat for a couple days before falling back to plants, you want your gut to be able to deal. And this flexibility is manifest in the diversity of human diets to this day. But what's the healthier state to be in most of the time? They looked at a number of different factors. First, the amount of short-chain fatty acids produced. Short-chain fatty acids like acetate, butyrate function to suppress inflammation, suppress cancer, and our gut flora on plant-based diets produced more than on animal-based diets. Other microbial metabolites such as secondary bile acids promote the development of cancer. And with a significant increase in bacterial enzyme activity to create these secondary bile acids on an animal-based diet, no surprise, significant increase in carcinogens like DCA, a secondary bile acid known to promote DNA damage and liver cancer. Microbial enzyme activity to produce the rotten egg gas hydrogen sulfide also shoots up on an animal-based diet, which stinks because it stinks, and because it damages DNA, and has been implicated in the development of inflammatory bowel diseases like ulcerative colitis. Hydrogen sulfide is made by pathogens like Bilophila wadsworthia, which is increased on the animal-based diet, again within just days, supporting the link between diet and the outgrowth of microorganisms capable of triggering inflammatory bowel disease. Whereas the only pathogen you see more of on a plant-based diet is just a virus that infects spinach. When people think fiber, they think constipation. And it's true, if we could get Americans just to eat the minimum recommended daily intake of fiber-containing foods, we could save our country $80 billion, and that's just from the effects on constipation alone. Accumulating evidence indicates that greater dietary fiber intakes reduce risk for diabetes, heart disease, certain cancers, weight gain, obesity, diverticular disease, as well as constipation. So we need to eat more fiber-rich foods, which means eating more whole grains, vegetables, fruits, and legumes, beans, split peas, chickpeas, and lentils. As fiber intake goes up, the risk of metabolic syndrome appears to go down. Less inflammation, and an apparent stepwise drop in obesity risk. And so, no surprise perhaps that greater dietary fiber intake is associated with a lower risk of heart disease, 9% lower risk for every additional 7 grams a day of total fiber consumed. That's just like some rice and beans or a few servings of fruits and vegetables. How does fiber do its magic? What are the mechanisms by which dietary fiber may extend our lifespan? Helps get rid of excess bile, feeds our good bacteria, changes our gut hormones, which collectively helps control our cholesterol and body weight, blood sugar, and blood pressure, which reduces the risk for cardiovascular disease. Reducing inflammation is a whole other mechanism by which fiber may help prevent chronic disease. The accompanying editorial to the Fiber and Heart Disease meta-analysis implored doctors to enthusiastically and skillfully recommend that patients consume more dietary fiber. That means a lot of whole plant foods. If, however, we do buy something packaged, the first word in the ingredients list should be whole, but then the rest of the ingredients could be junk. So a second strategy is to look at the ratio of grams of carbohydrates to grams of dietary fiber. We're looking for about 5 to 1 or less. So, for example, whole wheat Wonder Bread passes the first test, first word is whole, but then it's like corn syrup in a chemistry set. Let's see if it passes the 5 to 1 rule. What you do is divide the carbohydrates by the dietary fiber. 20 divided by 2.7 is about 7. That's more than 5, so it goes back on the shelf. Better than white, though, which clocks in at over 18. Now here's one that makes the cut. 15 divided by 3 equals 5. Can do the same thing with breakfast cereal. Multi-grain Cheerio sounds healthy, but has a ratio over 7, and then it just goes downhill from there. Here's an example of one that does make the cut, though sliding in under 4. The editorial concluded, the recommendation to consume diets with adequate amounts of dietary fiber may turn out to be the most important nutritional recommendation of all. Fiber-containing foods may not only help prevent heart disease, but help treat it as well. Heart patients who increase their intake of fiber after their first heart attack reduce their risk of a second and live longer than those who don't. But what if we really don't want to have a heart attack in the first place? If 7 grams of fiber gets us a 9% reduced risk, would 77 grams a day drop our risk 99%? Well, that's what they used to eat in Uganda, a country in which coronary heart disease, our #1 killer, was almost non-existent. Heart disease was so rare among those eating these traditional plant-based diets. There were papers published like this: a case of coronary heart disease in an African? After 26 years of medical practice, they finally recorded their first case of coronary heart disease in a judge consuming a partially westernized diet, having fiber-free foods like meat, dairy, and eggs displace some of the plant foods in his diet. Were there so few cases because Africans didn't live very long? No. The overall life expectancy was low because of diseases of childhood, like infections. But when they reach middle age, they had the best survival, thanks in part to our #1 killer being virtually absent. Of course, now diets have westernized across the country, and it gets to now be their #1 killer as well, from virtually non-existent to an epidemic. Some blame this change on too much animal fat. Others blame it on too little fiber, but they both point same solution, right? A diet centered around unrefined plant foods. In fact, sometimes it's easier to convince patients to improve their diet by eating more of the good foods to kind of crowd out some of the less healthy options. The dietary fiber hypothesis, first proposed in the 70s, zeroed in on fiber as the dietary component that was so protective against chronic disease. And since then, evidence has certainly accumulated. Those who eat lots of fiber appear protected from several chronic conditions. But maybe fiber is just a marker for the consumption of foods as grown, whole unprocessed plant foods, the only major source of fiber. So maybe all these studies showing fiber is good are really just showing that eating lots of unrefined plant foods are good. Fiber is just one component of plant food, and to neglect all the other components, like all the phytonutrients, may be to seriously limit our understanding. Why did Drs. Burkitt, Terrell, Painter, Walker, the fathers of the fiber theory, place all their bets on fiber? Well, one possible explanation for this is that they were doctors, and we doctors like to think in terms of magic bullets. That's how we're trained, like one pill, one operation. They were clinicians, not nutritionists, and so they developed a reductionist approach. The problem with that approach is that if we reach the wrong conclusion, we may come up with the wrong solution. Burkitt saw disease rates skyrocket after populations went from eating whole plant foods to refined plant and animal foods. But instead of telling people we should go back to eating whole plant foods, he was so convinced fiber was the magic component, his top recommendations was eat whole grain bread, but they never used to eat any kind of bread in Uganda, and sprinkle some spoonfuls of wheat bran onto your food. But studies to this day associating high fiber intake with lower risk of disease and death relate only to fiber from food intake, rather than from fiber isolates or extracts. It's not at all clear whether fiber consumed as a supplement is beneficial. In retrospect, maybe it was a mistake to isolate fiber from the overall field of plant food nutrition. The evidence supporting the value of fruits, vegetables, whole grains, as opposed to only fiber, has proved to be more consistent, much more consistent. Plant whole foods are what's of fundamental importance in our diet. Fiber is just one of the many beneficial components of fruits, vegetables, nuts, grains, and beans. Much of the effort on defining fiber and studying the fiber isolate would have been better applied to a whole plant food approach. What would have happened if Burkitt and others had instead emphasized the value of plant foods? The value of eating unrefined plant food, which incorporates fiber and phytonutrients, might have been the focus of attention rather than just isolated fiber, which leads people to shop in this aisle for their fiber instead of this aisle. Randomized controlled trials are considered the gold standard of scientific evidence. Half get the active treatment, half get a sugar pill. Works great for evaluating new drugs, but a concern is that evidence-based medicine has made a leap from considering randomized controlled trials to be a high standard to being the only standard. Consider this review of dietary interventions for multiple sclerosis by the esteemed Cochrane collaboration. They basically concluded there's not much diet can do. But what about Dr. Swank's success in treating MS with a low-saturated fat diet, the most effective treatment ever reported, published in some of the world's most prestigious journals? Of course they knew about his work, but the study didn't fit the inclusion criteria considered for the review because it was not a controlled trial. Demanding randomized trials make sense for drugs. Look, they're expensive, they're risky, killing off more than 100,000 Americans every year. But a healthy diet has no downsides, just good side effects, so we shouldn't have to wait on randomized controlled trials to start saving people's lives. Consider smoking. It took more than 7,000 studies and the deaths of countless habitual smokers before a consensus was reached in the medical community regarding the causal link between smoking and lung cancer, and still without a single randomized controlled trial. One has to wonder how many people are currently suffering needlessly while they wait for a randomized controlled trial to confirm the results found by other kinds of strong studies. In fact, a famous statistician, Ronald Fisher, railed against what he called propaganda to convince the public that cigarette smoking was dangerous, since they cannot produce evidence for randomized controlled trials. Look, 1,000 kids banned from smoking, you put another 1,000 kids forced to smoke at least a pack and a half a day. Now, if you did that kind of experiment, right, then there'd be no difficulty. Maybe instead of smoking causing lung cancer causes smoking. In its early stages, lung cancer may cause inflammation, so anyone suffering from chronic inflammation is going to want to smoke a cigarette to make themselves feel better, and it's kind of a comfort, right? That might be a real solace to anyone in the 15 years of approaching lung cancer, and to take the poor chap's cigarettes away from him would be rather like taking a white stick from a blind man. It would make an already unhappy person a little more unhappy than he need be. Fisher made invaluable contributions to the field of statistics, but his analysis of lung cancer and smoking was flawed by an unwillingness to examine the entire body of data available. His smokescreen may have been because he was a paid consultant to the tobacco industry, but also because he was himself a smoker. Part of his resistance to seeing the association may have been rooted in his own fondness for smoking, which makes me wonder about some of the foods many nutrition researchers may be fond of as well. A famous paper in the British Medical Journal lampooned this insistence on randomized controlled trials as the only legitimate evidence. Parachute use to prevent death and major trauma related to gravitational challenge, a systematic review of randomized controlled trials. They didn't find any. Sure, parachutes appear to reduce the risk of injury after gravitational challenge. We can observe that people who fall out of planes without them do tend to die a bit more than those with parachutes, but their effectiveness has not been proved with randomized controlled trials. Advocates of evidence-based medicine have criticized the adoption of interventions evaluated by using only observational data. We think that everyone might benefit if the most radical protagonists of this evidence-based medicine organized and participated in a double-blind randomized placebo-controlled trial of the parachute. In other words, individuals who insist that all interventions need to be validated by randomized controlled trial data need to come down to earth with a bump. The so-called French paradox is a term coined in the 80s by 3 Frenchmen to explain a curious finding. If you chart death from heart attack versus the amount of saturated fat and cholesterol countries consume, there appears to be a straight line. The more animal foods populations eat, the higher their death rates appear to be. Conversely, maybe if we got meat, egg, and dairy intake low enough, we could bring coronary death rates down towards 0. But 2 countries fell outside the line. Finland seemed to be doing worse than expected, and France appeared to be doing better, hence the paradox. How could France have similar saturated fat and cholesterol intake as Finland, but 5 times fewer fatal heart attacks? Everyone had their pet theories. Was it the whining? Was it the dining? Yes, animal foods were associated with coronary heart disease mortality, but plant foods appeared protected. So maybe the fact that the French were eating 4 times as many vegetables helps account for their lower death rates. But it turns out there's apparently no paradox at all. As Marion Nestle astutely pointed out, the French had just recently started eating so unhealthy, and chronic diseases takes decades to develop. I mean, the U.S. had been eating this way for 40 years, whereas the French had just picked it up. It's like if we all started smoking today and found no measurable increase in lung cancer tomorrow. It wouldn't mean smoking doesn't cause lung cancer, it just takes a while. So what happens when you actually run the numbers? If you compare coronary death rates to the amount of animal fat and cholesterol levels at the time, France does seem unusually protected. And if you compare death rates to what they were eating 2 decades before, they're still pretty far off the line. But it turns out French physicians underreport ischemic heart disease deaths on death certificates by as much as 20%, according to a World Health Organization investigation. So if you correct for that, then France basically comes back right in line with the death versus animal fat and death versus cholesterol lines, with about 4 times the fatal heart attack rates as Japan, and decades after 4 times the animal fat consumption. If one searches the internet for anti-aging interventions, a vast array of techniques are offered, from starvation to supplements. All are for sale, but none so far have been proven, despite the exorbitant claims on many of the websites. Resveratrol is one you'll likely come across, a component of red wine, which gained notoriety as a possible explanation for the so-called French paradox, which turns out is not so paradoxical after all. It turns out that countries with high wine consumption are coincidentally those in which saturated fat consumption used to be low, but increased in recent years. So the low mortality from ischemic heart disease may just reflect the earlier low levels of saturated fat consumption. The wine may just be a confounding factor. But it did help spark interest in resveratrol, the purported active ingredient of red wine, on which scientific papers are now published every day. More than 100 of those papers have been called into question, though, as one of the leading researchers in the field was found guilty of taking millions in taxpayer money only to fabricate and falsify his data. Hundreds of studies remain, though, so can pills now replace a healthy diet? Even a group of resveratrol scientists don't think resveratrol is worth supplementing. In contrast to the lacking data of resveratrol in humans, they say the animal data are promising and indicate the need for further human clinical trials. In rodents, resveratrol supplementation decreased cardiovascular risk factors, improved cardiovascular function and physical capacity, decreased inflammation, leading to improved vascular function. So it was put to the test in people, and almost the exact opposite was found. Specifically, taking resveratrol with athletic training abolished the reduction in blood pressure, cholesterol, and triglycerides, had a more arterial constricting effect than dilating effect, and led to a significantly lower increase in the training-induced increase in maximal oxygen uptake. Rodents on resveratrol get enhanced exercise performance, but in people, compared to those taking the sugar pill, the resveratrol induced a 45% lower increase in maximum aerobic capacity. Here the guys are working out like crazy, and the resveratrol is undercutting their efforts. This raises a larger issue, though. Mouse models are the cornerstone of modern biomedical research, yet systematic studies as to their usefulness are rarely done. This one was done on inflammation. After nearly 150 human clinical trials testing drugs that looked promising in mice, failed without exception. The result was surprising, almost shocking. The correlation was not only poor, it was virtually absent for the main study areas, burns trauma, endotoxemia. It turns out, for example, mice may be up to 1 million times less sensitive to inflammatory endotoxins. But anyway, the negative effects they found adds to the growing body of evidence questioning the positive effects of resveratrol supplementation in humans. Maybe that was the problem, though. It was resveratrol supplementation, giving people capsules containing 50 times the resveratrol they would normally get eating grapes, berries, peanuts, or chocolate. Maybe it was just too much of a good thing. To see if the amount one gets drinking red wine would be beneficial, you can look to the Chianti region of Tuscany to determine whether resveratrol levels associated with diet help protect against inflammation, cancer, cardiovascular disease, and death. And the answer is none of the above. Although annual sales of resveratrol supplements have reached $30 million in the United States alone, there's limited and conflicting human data demonstrating any human benefits, and there are no data concerning its long-term safety. The exercise study was supported in part by a manufacturer of resveratrol supplements, yet to their credit, the researchers responded this way to an angry letter by a supplement company consultant. It's our opinion that we as scientists have a responsibility to report what we find and not to twist our findings to fit the commercial interests. Dietary changes appear to be shifting universally towards a diet dominated by higher intakes of calorie-dense foods, corn syrup and sugar, animal products, and oils, thanks to global agricultural policies that have built in a long-term focus on creating things like cheap corn. Consumption of these foods high in saturated and trans fats, salt, and sugars, the cause of at least 14 million deaths every year. 14 million people dead. This is not a failure of individual willpower, says the Director General of the World Health Organization. This is a failure of political will to take on big business, which is a formidable opposition. Few governments prioritize health over big business. As we learned from experience with the tobacco industry, a powerful corporation can sell the public just about anything. This is difficult terrain for many public health scientists. It took 5 decades after the initial studies linking tobacco and cancer for effective public health policies to be put in place, with enormous cost to human health. Must we wait another 5 decades to respond to the epidemics of dietary diseases? They do have money on their side. The chemical, tobacco, and food industries have the luxury to share similar tactics with the drug companies, because they have the resources to do so. By contrast, powerful and cheap health-promoting activities like eating a healthy diet are too cheap, can't be patented. Preventing cardiovascular disease is not an easy task, because it means engaging in a battle against strong industrial sectors. But it is possible with sufficient political courage, and it's been done before. There's a great example of action in public health nutrition that is succeeding: the move back to breastfeeding. Breast milk doesn't make anyone any money, and so companies like Nestle pushed infant formulas, and millions of babies may have died as a result. So a global movement rose up and resulted in the passage of a code regulating the marketing of breast milk substitutes. As the Director General of the World Health Organization at the time said, without their constant lobbying, reminding us of our duty as public health officers, they simply would not have had the courage to do it. What has this got to do with nutrition and food policy now? Everything. If we want to improve public health, we need to seek out the food and nutrition equivalents of green peas. We should be prepared to stand up and be counted, even if it puts jobs and careers in nutrition on the line. To do that, the healthy food movement needs to stay united. Philip Morris is still fighting into the 21st century. Check out their latest campaign, dubbed Project Sunrise they hope will lead to a dawn of a new day for the company, an explicit divide-and-conquer strategy against the tobacco control movement. This is from the actual internal planning documents. They figure the number one vulnerability of the anti-smoking movement is that their success may blind organizations to carefully orchestrated efforts by the tobacco industry and its allies to accelerate turf wars and exacerbate philosophical schisms. Their overall objective was to attack the credibility of anti-smoking movement by creating schisms, to force them to fight amongst themselves. Think of how much of that we already do in the healthy food movement, right? But it's distracting us from the bigger picture. Because unity was defined as a source of strength for the anti-tobacco movement, anti-smoking movement, one of their primary strategies was to drive a wedge between various anti-smoking groups. Another was to weaken the public health movement's credibility. One strategy to weaken the credibility of anti-tobacco groups is to develop communication strategies to demonstrate the extremism of the health prevention movement. First tobacco, then alcohol, then meat, then who knows? Not only are tobacco lawyers a bit spelling challenged, but public health groups are part of a health promotion movement. Health prevention is more the purview of Big Ag. China burns about half of the world's coal, spewing heavy metals such as mercury and lead into the atmosphere, and affecting the development of neighboring children. But what if you don't live in China, or eat anything produced in China? Well, you could still be exposed to mercury that settles in the oceans if you eat fish and seafood, but some people drink something from China: tea. China is one of the biggest exporters, but their rapid industrialization has raised concerns about lead contamination. Lead is a toxin that can affect almost every organ in the body. And the more lead in the soil, the more that ends up in the tea leaves. And the closer the tea is grown to the highway, the higher the level, suggesting leaded gas, which wasn't banned in China until the year 2000, may also be playing a role. And just like larger, longer-living fish accumulate more mercury, longer-living leaves accumulate more lead. Young tea leaves appear to have 2 to 6 times less lead than mature tea leaves. So not only do the young leaves that are used to make green tea and white tea have significantly less lead than the older leaves used to make black and oolong tea, the lead in black and oolong tea appears to be released much more readily into the tea water when brewed. And so the health risk from lead may be 100 times lower for green tea compared to oolong and black. Since certain fungicides may have heavy metal impurities, one might assume organic teas would be less contaminated, but in a study of 30 common teas off North American store shelves, there did not seem to be less toxic element contamination than regular tea, though presumably organic tea would have much less pesticide contamination. In terms of lead, the source of the tea, the country of origin, appears to be the most important. So, bottom line, how much tea is safe to drink? Based on the most stringent safety limits in the world, like California's Prop 65 parameters, and the largest studies of tea lead contamination from around the world, this is what I was able to come up with. If you're not pregnant and you're just drinking green tea, it doesn't matter where you get your tea from. You can drink as much as you want, you can drink 1 cup of tea a day, you can drink 15 cups a day. But given the average levels of lead in Chinese black tea samples, more than 3 cups a day would exceed the daily safety limit for lead, or at least could exceed it. Now that's if you're drinking tea, throwing the tea leaves or tea bag away. If you're eating the leaves, like drinking matcha tea, which is powdered green tea, or throwing tea leaves into your smoothie like I like to do, I wouldn't add more than 2 or 3 heaping teaspoons, unless you're using Japanese green tea, which is so low in lead that you can safely eat 15 spoonfuls a day. The only reason I would caution more than 8 is that could exceed the daily recommended limit for caffeine for adults. What about children? If you're a 70-pound 10-year-old, Lead still isn't a problem drinking green tea, but the safe caffeine intake for children is probably down around 3 milligrams per kilogram, which would limit you to about 4 cups a day, though I wouldn't add more than 2 spoonfuls of Japanese green tea to a child's smoothie for caffeine reasons, and more than 1 of Chinese green tea for lead reasons. Similarly, I wouldn't like to see children drinking more than 1 cup of black tea a day, and wouldn't want them eating the leaves at all. What about pregnant women? Pregnant women should be able to drink a cup a day of green tea throughout pregnancy, regardless of the source, based on average tea lead levels. And the limit for Japanese tea is really just the caffeine limit above 4 cups a day. I wouldn't recommend drinking black tea during pregnancy, though, or eating any kind of tea leaves, unless you know you're getting tea from a low-lead source. What are some dietary strategies for the prevention and treatment of obesity? Large portion sizes are often targeted, and so restriction of portion size is an important element of many diet programs. But it's hard to get people to eat less food. A more effective approach may be to shift the emphasis from the quantity of food eaten to the quality of food eaten. By choosing foods with low calorie density, we can eat the same amount of food or even more food while losing weight. Are there foods with negative calories, foods that take more energy to digest than they provide? Does eating celery, for example, result in negative energy balance? Celery is a readily available whole food that has the ability to add bulk and flavor to a meal without adding excess calories. It's also subject to a renowned health myth that when consuming celery, there is a negative intake of calories, and therefore the energy required for its digestion, assimilation, and nutrient storage is assumed to be greater than the energy it itself contains. So they put it to the test. A cup of celery, about 2 stalks, has 16 calories. To digest that much celery, it takes 14 calories. So no, the consumption of celery does not induce a negative energy balance, but you are only left with 2 calories. This fact, combined with the high fiber and water content of celery, does make it a good snack for inclusion in a diet for weight loss or management. Maybe negative calorie foods is not a myth after all, though. Researchers at Penn State offered people a meal of pasta in which they could eat as much as they wanted. This is how many calories of pasta they ate. If in addition to the all-you-can-eat pasta meal, they gave people a small salad, what do you think happened? Did those 50 extra calories of salad just end up on top of the pasta calories? No. They ended up eating less pasta overall, and not just 50 calories less pasta, 65 less calories. And by adding a bigger salad, ended up eating 100 fewer calories. So effectively, the salad provided quote-unquote negative calories. They ate a salad on top of what else they were eating, ate more food, and ended up with less calories in their system, because it bulked up their stomach so much. Of course, it depends what kind of salad. They're not talking about your typical commercially available salads with like ranch dressing and cheese. You add those kind of salads, and yeah, you do end up eating less pasta, but there are so many calories in conventional salads, you end up worse off calorie-wise in the end. But healthy salads worked. They conclude, eat less is not always the best advice. For foods very low in energy density, such as water-rich vegetables like salad, larger portions increase satiety, the feeling of fullness, and reduce meal calorie intake. What happens if you have people add fruit to their regular diet? 3 apples or 3 pears a day as snacks between meals on top of whatever else they were eating. Fruit is low in calories, but not 0, so if you add food to people's diet, even healthy foods, won't they gain weight? No, they lost a couple pounds. Maybe it was all that fiber? If you remember, we learned our gut bacteria can create anti-obesity compounds from fiber. That's why they also had a cookie group. 3 apples, 3 pears, or 3 cookies with enough oats in them to have about the same amount of fiber as the fruit. Despite the fiber, adding cookies to one's diet does not lead to weight loss. They think the weight-reducing secret of fruit is its low energy density, meaning you get a lot of food for just a few calories, so it fills you up. Energy density is a relatively new concept that has been identified as an important factor in body weight control in both adults and in children and adolescents. Energy density is defined as the amount of calories per unit weight of a food or beverage. Water, for example, provides a significant amount of weight without adding calories. Fiber, too. Thus, foods high in fiber and water are generally lower in energy density. On the other hand, because dietary fat provides the greatest amount of calories per weight, foods high in fat are generally high in energy density. The CDC offers some examples. High energy density foods are like bacon, lots of calories in a small package. A medium energy density food is like a bagel, and a low density food typified by fruits and vegetables. In general, the lower the better, with 2 exceptions. Soda is heavy, so heavy that by energy density it looks less harmful than it is, and nuts have so much fat they appear less healthy than they are. Otherwise, though, the science supports a relationship between energy density and body weight, such that consuming diets lower in energy density may be an effective strategy for weight control. This is because people tend to eat a consistent weight of food, so when there's less calories per pound, calorie intake is reduced. A small drop in energy density can lead to a small drop in weight, and the greater the decrease in energy density, the greater the weight loss. Energy density can be reduced in a variety of ways, such as the addition of fruits and vegetables to recipes, or by lowering the fat or sugar content. And indeed, that's how we evolved, eating predominantly low energy density foods, such as fruits, vegetables, plants, and tubers, starch-filled roots like sweet potatoes. The first study to emphasize how fruits and vegetables could affect energy density and food intake was conducted more than 30 years ago. Researchers were able to cut people's caloric intake nearly in half, from 3,000 calories a day down to 1,570, without cutting portions, just by substituting less calorie-dense foods, which means lots of fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and beans, compared to a high-energy density meal with lots of meat and sugar. Nearly half the calories, but they enjoyed the meals just as much. They tried this in Hawaii, putting people on a traditional Hawaiian diet with all the plant foods they could eat. Lost an average of 17 pounds in just 21 days, resulting in better cholesterol, triglycerides, blood sugars, and blood pressure. Caloric intake dropped 40%, but not by eating less food. In fact, they lost 17 pounds in 21 days eating more food, 4 pounds of food. But because plants tend to be so calorically dilute, one can stuff oneself without getting the same kind of weight gain. And the energy density of foods is of interest for weight management, not only because it allows people to eat satisfying portions while limiting calories, but also because reductions in energy density are associated with improved dietary quality. For example, lower energy-dense diets associated with lower risk of pancreatic cancer. Lower energy density foods tend to be healthier foods, so we get the best of both worlds. In 1975, a remarkable case was reported of a 42-year-old man suffering from a malignant form of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, who experienced a dramatic regression of the cancer after being given large doses of vitamin C intravenously. He seemed cured, so they stopped the vitamin C, and the cancer came surging back. So they restarted the vitamin C, apparently inducing a complete second remission. Now, sometimes cancer does just spontaneously regress. It's rare, but not unheard of. So one could argue that the first remission was spontaneous. It was just a coincidence that it happened just when they started the vitamin C. But given the trajectory the cancer was on, followed by a rapid remission, followed by the relapse when the vitamin C was stopped, followed by a second remission once restarted, it does strongly suggest the vitamin C had something to do with it. Now, Multiple spontaneous regressions do exist. There was a recent case, for example, of a woman with cervical cancer, apparently cured with radiation and chemo, but when the cancer came back, she refused further treatment. Yet the tumors disappeared on their own, and then came back, and then disappeared, then came back, then disappeared, then came back, then disappeared for a fourth spontaneous remission. And that was with no apparent treatment at all. So it's possible this vitamin C case is just a crazy coincidence fluke, and the vitamin C didn't help at all. You never know until you put it to the test. So these researchers enlisted the help of Linus Pauling, considered the greatest chemist of the 20th century, who was known to be interested in vitamin C. If he couldn't get funding, nobody could get funding, and he couldn't get funding. They went to the National Cancer Institute with promising data on the first 40 cancer patients they treated with vitamin C, and asked that they carry out a randomized, double-blind trial, meaning take a group of incurable cancer patients for which we have nothing more to offer, randomly split them into two groups, and infuse one group with vitamin C and the other with something just like saline, basically water, and see who lives longest. Neither the patient nor the doctors would know who got which to eliminate bias and placebo effects. And they went back year after year after year, asking for grants to study it themselves if the National Cancer Institute wasn't going to do it, and they got rejected year after year after year. So they scraped up whatever funds they could find and did their best with what they had, and published their famous findings in 1976. So they didn't have a controlled trial, but by that point they had treated 100 terminal cancer patients with vitamin C, and so they compared their progress to that of 1,000 similar patients who did not get vitamin C. For each patient treated with vitamin C, they found 10 patients about the same age, with the same kind of cancer, that had been treated at the same hospital, but without the vitamin C infusions. This is what they found. Let's look at breast cancer, for example. Here's the survival curve for terminal breast cancer. Remember, these were all terminal cancer patients. As you can see, in the control group, within 100 days, more than 80% of the women were dead. But in the vitamin C group, half were still alive nearly a year later. They had women with terminal breast cancer still alive 2,270 days later and still counting. The control groups for all the different cancers did predictably bad, with the vast majority dead within 1 to 200 days, while the vitamin C-treated patients appeared to do substantially better. All in all, the average survival time was 4 times as great for the vitamin C subjects, more than 200 days compared to only 50 days for the controls. The results, they conclude, clearly indicate that this simple and safe form of medication is of definite value in the treatment of patients with advanced cancer. So that was 1976. What happened? Critics understandably attacked the study for using these kind of after-the-fact controls. I mean, you could see how this could introduce bias. I mean, if you consciously or unconsciously chose control group patients who were sicker than your treatment group patients, they would die sooner than your patients, but it would have nothing to do with the treatment. The control group folks would just have started out in a worse place. And indeed, there's evidence that that's what happened. A full 20% of the control group died within a few days after being declared terminal, compared to none in the treatment group, which really does sound fishy. But the trial was successful in finally convincing the National Cancer Institute to fund randomized controlled trials performed by the prestigious Mayo Clinic, no less. What did they find? Vitamin C is no stranger to controversy, as evidenced by the fact that it took 40 years between when citrus fruits were shown to cure scurvy in the 1700s and the widespread implementation of this practice to save lives. Is it possible we're in the midst of a similar 40-year lag, with research in the mid-70s purporting to show that terminal cancer patients treated with vitamin C lived 4 times longer, and sometimes 20 times longer? Researchers at the venerable Mayo Clinic decided to put it to the test, and they failed to show any benefit. The survival curves for both groups of patients were essentially identical. In fact, the one success story, a guy with end-stage pancreatic cancer who had shown no response to any previous attempts at chemo, but started improving, was still alive 5 years later, was one of the patients who got the sugar pill placebos. It was official. Vitamin C didn't work. The apparently positive results reported previously, read the accompanying National Cancer Institute editorial, almost certainly resulted from systematic bias in terms of which historic controls were chosen to compare with the treatment group. Linus Pauling disagreed, arguing that the prior chemotherapy in nearly all the Mayo Clinic study patients may have negated the effect of the vitamin C. If the vitamin C works by boosting your immune system, and your immune system is first destroyed by chemo, the thinking goes, well, no wonder it didn't work. In the original vitamin C study, only 4 out of the 100 patients had ever received chemo. The Mayo Clinic researchers were skeptical, but Pauling had a legendary reputation in science for being right about all sorts of things, so one might do worse, perhaps, than rely at least partly on Pauling's awesome intuition. And so a second randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled study was performed on patients with advanced cancer, but this time who had no prior chemotherapy. And again, it was a spectacular failure. No measurable response. The cancer in the vitamin C group progressed just as rapidly, and the patients on the placebo sugar pills lived just as long. In fact, if anything, the sugar pill group lived longer. At 2 years, everyone in the vitamin C group was dead, but there were still a few survivors in the placebo group that made it out at least past 3. And so they concluded high-dose vitamin C therapy is not effective against advanced cancer, regardless of whether the patient has had prior chemotherapy or not. Because the Mayo Clinics were taken as definitive, the medical community concluded that vitamin C was useless. However, in the Mayo Clinic studies, they gave the vitamin C orally in supplements, not intravenously through the vein. In retrospect, the route of administration may have been key. In the original study, they started out infusing 10 grams of vitamin C a day intravenously, where in both the Mayo Clinic studies, designed to replicate the protocol, they just gave people vitamin C supplements to take orally, just sent them home to swallow 20 capsules a day. Same dose, but 10 grams given orally is not the same thing as 10 grams given IV, but they could be excused because this wasn't discovered until decades later. It turns out vitamin C concentrations in our bloodstream is tightly controlled, such that if you try to swallow more than you'd get like eating 5 servings of fruits and veggies, your body cuts down on the absorption in the intestine. For example, if you go from eating 200 milligrams a day to eating 10 times more, 2,500 milligrams, the level in your bloodstream only goes up 3 milligrams per liter, or quart of blood. In contrast, because intravenous injection bypasses the intestinal absorption system, it can result in super high blood concentrations, as in like 100 or 200 times the level in the bloodstream you can achieve just taking vitamin C orally, no matter how much you take. So maybe that explains why the original studies seemed so promising, but the follow-up studies were so disappointing. This raises the controversial question of a reevaluation of vitamin C in cancer treatment. Studies in the 70s showed an extraordinary survival gain in terminal cancer patients with vitamin C, a simple, relatively non-toxic therapy, and so no wonder it got a lot of attention, especially when reported by world-renowned scientist Linus Pauling. But studies like this in the 1980s found no such benefit, and so alas, they were left with the inevitable conclusion that the apparent positive results in the original study were the product of bias rather than treatment effectiveness. In the 1990s, though, an alternative explanation arose. The disappointing 80s research only used oral vitamin C, whereas the apparently successful 70s experiments also gave vitamin C intravenously. And we didn't realize until the 90s that the same dose given IV can lead to dramatically higher levels in the bloodstream than if taken orally. So maybe high-dose vitamin C does help in terminal cancer, but maybe only when given intravenously. Encouraging case reports continue to be published. Here there was a regression, remission, and cure documented in individual cases of advanced kidney cancer, bladder cancer, and lymphoma. But that's 3 success stories out of how many? If it was 3 out of 100, or even 3 out of 1,000, well, OK, if the treatment is sufficiently non-toxic. But there's evidence that IV vitamin C is widely used in the alternative medicine world, as in 86% of practitioners surveyed. Just those 172 practitioners alone treated about 10,000 patients a year. And you ask the manufacturers, and they're selling hundreds of thousands of vials of the stuff in the US. Now, it's not all being used for cancer, but presumably at least thousands of cancer patients are being treated every year with IV vitamin C, making the publication of 3 remarkable case reports seem less impressive. So no matter how amazing these cases seemed, it's possible the cancers just spontaneously regressed all on their own, and it was just a coincidence that happened after they were given vitamin C. To know for sure, you have to put it to the test. To date, there's been some small pilot studies, and the results so far have been disappointing. The good news is that even insane doses of IV vitamin C seem remarkably safe, but failed in this study of 24 patients to demonstrate anti-cancer activity. Similar small studies have been published all the way through to the present, with tantalizing but inconclusive results. What we do know is that the present state of cancer treatment is unsatisfactory. People have this perception that chemotherapy will significantly enhance their chances for a cure, but put all our cancer-killing chemo together, and the overall contribution to 5-year survival is on the order of 2%. All those side effects for 2.1%, at a cost of maybe $100,000 per patient per year. So it may be worth looking deeper into therapies like IV vitamin C. However, the lack of financial reward, since vitamin C can't be patented and sold for $100,000, and bias against alternative medicine could dissuade conventional investigators and funding agencies from seriously considering this approach. So decades later, what can we conclude? After trials which have included at least 1,600 patients over 33 years, we have to conclude that we still don't know whether vitamin C has any clinically significant anti-tumor activity. Although there is currently no definitive evidence of benefit, the Mayo Clinic randomized controlled trials did not negate the potential benefit based on what we now know about the oral versus IV routes of administration. So we're kind of back to square one. Does it work or not? There are highly polarized views on both sides, but everyone's working off the same incomplete data. What we need are carefully controlled clinical trials. The question is, what do we do until then? If it was completely non-toxic, then one would argue, well, what do you got to lose? But it's not. It's only relatively non-toxic. For example, there have been rare but serious cases of kidney injury reported. After all, if it's so safe, why did our bodies evolve to so tightly control against excess absorption? It can also be expensive and time-consuming. Each infusion can cost $100 to $200 out of pocket, since insurance doesn't pay for it, which can be quite a boon for alternative medicine practitioners. About 90% of the millions of doses of vitamin C being dispensed are in for-profit arrangements. So there's financial pressures pushing in both directions, for and against this treatment. Now, given the relative safety and expense, though, if controlled studies even find a small benefit, it would be worthwhile. And if they don't, OK, fine. The vitamin C question can be put to rest once and for all. But in cancer treatment, we don't have the luxury of jettisoning possibly effective, relatively non-toxic treatments. We should revisit promising avenues without prejudice and with open mind. Back in the 1990s, a major susceptibility gene was discovered for Alzheimer's, called ApoE4. If we have one ApoE4 gene, either from our mom or dad, like about 15% of the US population does, our risk of getting Alzheimer's is tripled. And if we are like one of the 1 in 50 folks who have ApoE4 genes from both parents, we may be at 9 times the risk. The highest frequency of ApoE4 in the world is in Nigeria, but they also have some of the lowest Alzheimer's rates. To understand this paradox, one has to understand the role of ApoE. What does the ApoE gene do? ApoE is the principal cholesterol carrier in the brain. So their diet appeared to have trumped their genes, their low cholesterol levels, from their low intake of animal fat, living off mostly grains and vegetables. High ApoE4, but Alzheimer's a rarity, thanks, perhaps, to their low cholesterol level, which any of us can achieve eating healthfully too. These findings suggest that long-term changes in plasma cholesterol can lead to changes in ApoE gene expression. Just because we may have been dealt some bad genetic cards doesn't mean we can't reshuffle the deck with diet. We can't change our genetic makeup, but we can reduce or prevent high cholesterol. In the study of 1,000 people for over 20 years, ApoE4 doubled the odds of Alzheimer's, but high cholesterol nearly tripled the threat. So the risk for Alzheimer's disease from treatable factors, elevated cholesterol and blood pressure, appears to be greater than that from the dreaded Alzheimer's susceptibility gene. In fact, projecting from their data, controlling lifestyle factors could reduce a person's risk for Alzheimer's disease, even if they had the double-barreled ApoE4 gene from both parents, from 9 or 10 times the odds down to just 2. People tend to have a fatalistic view about developing Alzheimer's disease, like, look, it's going to happen if it's going to happen. But studies like this undermine such a view. We just need to emphasize the need for preventing and treating high blood pressure and cholesterol in the first place to reduce our risk for heart disease, stroke, and Alzheimer's disease, and as a result potentially enhance quantity and quality of life. Of equal importance, these data should be comforting to anyone interested in attempting to reduce the risk for and future burden of Alzheimer's disease. An extraordinary study was published in the Journal of the American Diabetes Association, curcumin extract for prevention of type 2 diabetes, a randomized, double-blinded, placebo-controlled trial of folks diagnosed with prediabetes. Half got supplements of curcumin, the yellow pigment in the spice turmeric and curry powder, and the other half got identical-looking placebos, and they just followed them out for 9 months to see who ended up with diabetes. After 9 months of treatment, 16% of patients in the placebo group went on to get full-blown diabetes. But how many in the curcumin group? None. The curcumin group saw a significant improvement in fasting blood sugars, glucose tolerance, hemoglobin A1c, insulin sensitivity, pancreatic insulin-producing beta cell function, measured 2 different ways, and insulin sensitivity. What if you already have diabetes? Same beneficial effects, and at a fraction of the dose. The prediabetes studies used the equivalent of like a quarter cup of turmeric a day, whereas this used only about a teaspoon's worth, which is doable through diet rather than supplements. And what's interesting here is the purported mechanism. Fat in the bloodstream plays an important role in the development of insulin resistance and ultimately type 2 diabetes. Fat builds up inside your muscle cells and gums up the works. All the inflammation interferes with insulin signaling, and look what the curcumin was able to do to fat levels in the blood. The first study to show that these turmeric spice compounds may have an anti-diabetic effect by decreasing fats in the blood. So if you're pre-diabetic, it might be a good idea to add turmeric to your diet, but it's important to recognize that prediabetes is a disease in itself, increasing the risk of death, cancer, heart disease, vision loss. So it's not enough to just prevent progression to full-blown diabetes. Prediabetes may be cured completely with a healthy plant-based diet, as I've covered before. Remember that smoker P study? Well, yes, those who abuse their bodies with unhealthy diets can lower their risk by eating powerful plants, but better to cut out the crap altogether. The strategy of preventing heart disease risk in childhood has been described as radical, but is the concept really so radical? What would be radical is to actually adopt this concept and actually do something about it. The alternative is to continue indefinitely to rely upon the late, incompletely effective, costly strategies for treating already established risk factors like high cholesterol levels that may have been causing progression of the disease their whole lives. A failure to diagnose and treat risk factors in youth may miss an opportunity to prevent the long-term consequences of heart disease, the leading cause of disability and death in the United States for both men and women. We could prevent 90% of heart attacks. Such a claim would have seemed outrageous 50 years ago, but now we know stopping this epidemic is achievable. There's two ways we can do this. The first is the clinical medicine approach, in which physicians identify kids at risk and vigorously advocate lifestyle changes or drug them. But this model can at best be applied to only a few individuals. We got 15-minute doctor visits, preventive care isn't reimbursed, and interventions directed at individuals are often ineffective because they're not supported by the surrounding culture. To stop the disease process completely, one may have to go on an almost exclusively plant-based diet, something that hasn't been officially recommended for fear of discouraging the public. But our job as physicians is to tell the truth and let the public decide. That's why we need broad social and cultural changes that pervade the entire population to prevent atherosclerosis. The evidence justifies igniting a veritable social movement that eventually will be officially supported by the powers that be. The goal of eliminating 90% of coronary heart disease is feasible, but the cultural and societal changes necessary to achieve this goal won't be easy, and they won't happen soon, but it's time to start. So maybe the newest Academy of Pediatrics approved guidelines for universal cholesterol screening of all children starting around age 9 might actually be too conservative. How about starting at age 2? That's when parents are generally engaged and vigilant about well-child checkups, and when there are additional opportunities for parent education about the importance of diet, exercise, and healthy lifestyle, not only for their kids, but for them as well, because atherosclerosis can start even before birth and depend on what our moms ate. Fatty streak formation occurs in human fetal arteries, and is greatly worsened by how high the pregnant mother's cholesterol is. Arteries were obtained from spontaneous miscarriages and premature newborns who died within 12 hours of birth, right around the end of the second trimester. They looked at the arteries of fetuses from mothers with normal cholesterol levels and from pregnant moms with high cholesterol, and fetal arteries from mothers with high cholesterol contained dramatically greater lesions. This suggests not only that heart disease may start much earlier than we previously assumed, but that it depends on maternal cholesterol levels. So, atherosclerosis might not just start out as a nutritional disease of childhood, but a nutritional disease of pregnancy. Like any group with vested interests, the food industry resists regulation. Faced with a growing scientific consensus that salt increases blood pressure, major food manufacturers have adopted desperate measures to try to stop governments from recommending salt reduction. Rather than reformulate their products and save lives, manufacturers have lobbied governments, refused to cooperate, encouraged misinformation campaigns, and tried to discredit the evidence. After all, salt is the main source of flavor in processed foods. Of course, they could improve the flavor by adding real ingredients, but like making a Pop-Tart with actual strawberries would be more expensive, cut into profits. The evidence that they're trying to discredit includes double-blind, randomized trials dating back decades. You take people with high blood pressure, put them on a sodium-restricted diet, and their blood pressure drops. Then if you keep them on a low-salt diet and add a placebo, nothing happens. But if you instead give them salt in the form of a time-release sodium pill secretly, their blood pressure goes back up. And the more sodium you secretly slip them, the higher their blood pressure climbs. Even just a single meal can do it. If you take people with normal blood pressure, give them a bowl of soup containing the amount of salt a regular meal might contain, and your blood pressure goes up over the next 3 hours compared to the same soup with no added salt. Why, though? High blood pressure appears to be our body's way to push out excess salt out of our system. Dozens of such studies have been done, showing that if we reduce our salt intake, we can reduce our blood pressure, and the greater the reduction, the greater the benefit. The so-called DASH diet, which I've covered before, commonly used to capture the blood pressure benefits of a more plant-based diet. But how do we know the benefits had anything to do with eating less salt instead of just eating more fruits and vegetables? Because it was put to the test. Sure, eating healthier lowers blood pressure no matter how much salt we eat, but even if we stick to the same diet, lowering salt helps independently of other dietary improvements. You can do this on a community level. You take two matched villages that both start out about the same. In the control village, on average, blood pressures went up or stayed the same. But in the village where they were able to cut down on salt intake, blood pressures went down. Whereas if we don't cut down, chronic high salt intake can lead to a gradual increase in blood pressure throughout life, as shown in the famous INTERSALT study. 52 centers from 32 countries participated with hundreds of participants each, and 4 of those centers were in populations that ate so little salt they actually complied with the American Heart Association guidelines for salt reduction. Something less than 1% of Americans achieve. In a population where everyone makes the cutoff, not a single case of high blood pressure was found, not one case of high blood pressure. But not only that, the older folks had the same blood pressure as the teenagers. This is why including such populations is so important. If you just look at the 48 centers in the industrialized Western world, there does not appear to be any relationship between rising blood pressure with age and how much sodium people are getting every day, right? It just looks like a random assortment of dots. Now, the salt industry looks at this and says, aha! See, I told you so. No relationship between salt and increasing blood pressures as you get older. But maybe that's because they're all getting too much salt. The American Heart Association recommendation is that everyone get their salt intakes under here. So they're all way over. You can imagine a similar result if this was instead lung cancer rates versus packs of cigarettes smoked every year. Whether you smoked 150 packs a year or 200 packs a year, it might not make much of a difference. To see a relationship between smoking and cancer, you'd have to compare smokers to those who rarely light up. And indeed, if you add in those low-salt populations that get little or no high blood pressure as they get older, and you end up with a highly statistically significant relationship between increasing sodium and increasing blood pressure. But only if you include people that actually comply with the SALT guidelines. As with so many lifestyle interventions, they only work if you actually do it. The revelation that fish oil appears useless in preventing heart disease, as I reviewed before, in either heart patients or for those trying to prevent heart disease in the first place, leads one to wonder, how did this whole fish tale begin? Well, the common mythology is that in response to anecdotal reports of low prevalence of coronary heart disease among the Eskimo, Danish researchers Bang and Dyerberg went there and confirmed a very low incidence of heart attack. Now, the absence of coronary artery disease would be strange in a meat-based diet, hardly any fruits and vegetables, violating all principles of heart-healthy nutrition. This paradox, then, was attributed to all the seal and whale blubber they were eating, which is extremely rich in omega-3 fish fat, and the rest is history. The problem is, it isn't true. The fact is they never examined the cardiovascular status of the Eskimo. They just accepted at face value this notion that coronary atherosclerosis is almost unknown among the Eskimo, a concept that has been disproven over and over starting in the 30s. In fact, going back over 1,000 years. We have frozen Eskimo mummies with atherosclerosis. Another from 500 years ago, woman in her early 40s, atherosclerosis in her aorta and coronary arteries. And these aren't just isolated cases. The totality of evidence from actual clinical investigations, autopsies, imaging techniques, is that they have the same plague of coronary artery disease that non-Eskimo populations have, and actually twice the fatal stroke rate, and don't live particularly long. Considering the dismal health status of Eskimos, it's remarkable that instead of labeling their diet as dangerous to health, they just accepted and echoed the myth, trying to come up with a reason to explain the false premise. Such dismal health that the westernization of their diets actually lowered their rates of ischemic heart disease. You know your diet's bad when the arrival of Twinkies improves your health. So why do so many researchers to this day unquestioningly parrot the myth? Publications still referring to Bang and Dyerberg's nutritional studies as proof that Eskimos have low prevalence of heart disease represent either misinterpretation of the original findings or an example of what's called confirmation bias, which is when people cherry-pick or slant information to confirm their preconceived notions. They quote the great scientist Francis Bacon, "We prefer to believe what we prefer to be true." And so we get literally thousands of articles on the alleged benefits of omega-3 fatty acids. We got a billion-dollar industry selling fish oil capsules, millions of Americans taking this stuff, all based on a hypothesis that was questionable from the beginning. Why do dogs lick their wounds? In fact, they even lick our wounds, leading to a question posed nearly a half-century ago in the medical literature: might there be some kind of healing property of dog saliva? Well, it appears there are a number of immune defense mechanisms in saliva, one of which involves nitric oxide. Licking of human skin results in production of nitric oxide from salivary nitrite, which kills skin pathogens and comes from the nitrates we eat from our diet. How do we know we can get nitric oxide from licked human skin? They had a bunch of volunteers lick their hands all over, front and back. Today we have a better way to clean wounds called soap and water, and we should never actually let our pets lick open wounds, as there are cases of serious infections reported. The reason I bring it up is because this transformation of nitrates from our diet into nitrites in our mouth has important implications for our health. Insufficient nitric oxide production is recognized as the earliest event in the onset and progression of a number of chronic diseases, including high blood pressure and peripheral artery disease, and a number of inflammatory conditions. If you remember, nitrates come from vegetables in our diets, beets and green leafy vegetables. Good bacteria on our tongue convert nitrates into nitrites, which can circulate throughout the body to create nitric oxide. And any nitrates our tongue bacteria missed the first time around gets pumped by our body back into our saliva to give our tongue bacteria a second chance. So one way we can become nitric oxide production deficient is to not eat enough vegetables in the first place, so that should be the first step. But if our tongue bacteria die off, the cycle is broken no matter how many vegetables we eat. That's why we should not use antiseptic mouthwash. If you remember me profiling this important study, perhaps the largest public health initiative in the Western world has focused on improvement of diet, particularly in those of high risk of cardiovascular disease, our #1 killer. The most protective food for our heart may be green leafy vegetables because, like beets, they have a lot of nitrates. And so if you eat some beet juice, you can get a remarkable drop in blood pressure within just hours, but only if you swallow. The nitric oxide pathway can be interrupted if you use an antibacterial mouthwash, or by spitting and not swallowing because of the critical action of our tongue bacteria on the nitrates in our saliva. So we have to eat our vegetables and keep our tongue bacteria happy, so no antibacterial mouthwash. But what about antibacterial toothpaste? There's a toothpaste on the market that contains an antibacterial chemical called triclosan. Concern has been raised about the antibacterial mouthwashes, but what about the toothpaste? We didn't know until this study. Here's the nitric oxide, nitrite, and nitrate levels after brushing with regular toothpaste, and here's after triclosan toothpaste. No difference. See, our good bacteria, good tongue bacteria, live in the cracks on the surface of our tongue, and if you just brush your teeth and not your tongue, the chemical doesn't seem to get down there. So, is triclosan toothpaste safe? Well, it won't make your heart miss a beet or beet juice. The use of triclosan toothpaste may not be associated with any increase in serious adverse cardiac events, and though studies on rats suggest the chemical can affect thyroid function, the use of triclosan toothpaste does not seem to affect human thyroid function. A study funded by Colgate, no conflict of interest there, concluded that triclosan was both safe and effective, producing a significant reduction in gingivitis, plaque, and bleeding. Though an independent review by the Cochrane Group suggests that the reduction, may be statistically significant, but may not be beneficial enough to yield clinical significance. And with regard to safety, the reason states are starting to ban the stuff is because of data like this. Despite the lack of efficacy, the stuff is so ubiquitous that most of the U.S. population is exposed. Because the rapid rise in obesity in the U.S. parallels the introduction of the chemical, because there are two potential mechanisms by which it might alter human weight by mucking with our gut flora or our hormones, researchers at Stanford decided to assess the association between triclosan levels flowing through people's bodies and how heavy they are, and indeed found an association between triclosan levels and increase in body mass index. They suggest further studies on how this chemical could be altering human growth and well-being. "90% of women report having painful menstrual cramps at least some of the time. Around the Mediterranean, fennel seeds have been traditionally used to relieve painful menstruation. We call them seeds, but they're actually whole little fruits. Hard to create placebo seeds, though, so they used the fennel seed extract to put it to the test. The women started out with 6 out of 10 pain, but down to 4 out of 6 within an hour, all better than placebo. 52% of the women rated the fennel seed treatment as excellent, compared to only 8% of the women in the placebo group, who were just unknowingly given capsules containing flour. But women don't take flour for cramps, they take drugs like ibuprofen. Mefenamic acid is in the same class of anti-inflammatory NSAID drugs, and may actually work better than ibuprofen, but it's not over-the-counter. How did it do against an extract of fennel seeds? Most started out in severe pain, but ended up pain-free after treatment. And the fennel worked just as well as the drug class considered the treatment of choice, without the side effects of the drug, which include diarrhea, rashes, autoimmune anemia, and kidney toxicity. And the drug doesn't help with the other symptoms of bad periods. Women can feel nauseated too, not just in pain, out of sorts, weak, achy, and diarrheic, but fennel seeds seemed to help, though the control group was not given a placebo, so you don't know how much of it is the placebo effect. One downside is that on fennel, women bleed about 10% more. See, menstrual cramps are caused by the uterus contracting so hard that its own blood supply is compromised, and the way we think fennel works is through muscle relaxation, because it also helps with infant colic, which is thought due to intestinal spasms. The advantage of fennel here, too, is the lack of side effects, and unlike the drug that's used, which they note unfortunately can work a little too well to get your baby to stop crying by developing side effects like death. Ginger, on the other hand, is effective for cramps and reduces bleeding when an eighth of a teaspoon of ginger powder is taken 3 times a day during one's period. An eighth of a teaspoon. This is important since up to 18 million young women in the United States experience iron deficiency anemia due to heavy menstrual bleeding. The amount of blood loss was estimated using a scoring system that gives points for level of saturation, clot size, and on ginger they went from like a half a cup per period down to a quarter cup. Ginger appears to be a highly effective treatment in the reduction of menstrual blood loss. It's cheap, about 6 cents a month, easy to use, and may have fewer side effects than other chemical medications and invasive approaches. Even sometimes fewer than placebo. They used lactose, milk sugar, for the sugar pills, which may have caused the flatulence. Ginger may also work better for premenstrual syndrome. An eighth of a teaspoon twice a day of ginger powder for a week before one's period yields a significant drop in PMS mood, physical, and behavioral symptoms, whereas fennel may help with PMS anxiety and depression, but not with the emotional and physical symptoms. There are other dietary interventions that can help, like a reduction in salt and animal fat consumption, something I've addressed before. Whatever works, since sometimes, evidently, PMS symptoms can lead to murder. And indeed, there are cases like Christine English, who, at that time of the month, ran down her husband. Accepting PMS as a defense, she was released with 1-year probation. Chronic kidney disease is a major public health problem affecting about 1 in 8 Americans, increasing the risk of disease and death even among those with only mild decreases in kidney function. So low-cost, low-risk preventive strategies that anyone can do are needed to address the epidemic of kidney disease. Diet plays a role in kidney function decline. Specifically, diets higher in animal protein, animal fat, and cholesterol may be associated with protein leakage into the urine, which is a sign of kidney damage. And generally, diets high in fruits, vegetables, whole grains, lower in meats and sweets may be protective against kidney function decline. In comparison to the diet eaten by our ancestors, not only are we eating more saturated fat, sugar, and salt, we're now eating an acid-producing diet, as opposed to a base-producing or alkaline diet. Ancestral human diets were largely plant-based, and as such produced more base than acid. Dietary acid load is determined by the balance of acid-inducing food, which is rich in animal proteins such as meats, eggs, and cheese, offset by base-inducing food, such as fruits and vegetables. In this national survey of 12,000 American adults, dietary acid load was associated with kidney damage among U.S. adults. Acid-inducing diets are believed to impact the kidney via tubular toxicity, damage to the tiny, delicate urine-making tubes in the kidney via increased ammonia production. See, ammonia is a base, so the kidney creates ammonia to buffer the acid from the food we eat. This is beneficial in the short term to get rid of the acid. However, in the long term, all that extra ammonia in our kidneys, day in, day out, can exert toxic effects. Our kidney function tends to decline progressively after our 30s, and by our 80s our kidney capacity may be down to half. Perhaps this so-called age-related decline in kidney function is a result of damage induced by a lifetime of ammonia overproduction. That's just one theory, though. The acidic pH may increase the production of free radicals and damage the kidney that way, and add to scarring. Not only is protein derived from plant foods accompanied by antioxidants to fight the free radicals, Plant protein is less acid-forming in the first place, because it tends to have less sulfur-containing amino acids, one of the reasons plant foods tend to be less acid-forming than animal foods. It's because acid is produced by the sulfur in the protein. There's less in plant proteins. So, the more important determinant of the effect of dietary protein on kidney disease progression is the quality of the ingested protein. In other words, whether it induces acid production, like most animal protein, or base production, like most fruits and vegetables, rather than the quantity of protein ingested. Since American diets are largely acid-producing, because they're deficient in fruits and vegetables that contain large amounts of animal products, changing from a standard American diet to a vegan diet may improve acidosis in patients with chronic kidney disease. Under normal circumstances, a vegetarian diet is alkalizing, whereas a non-vegetarian diet leads to an acid load. This is true even of vegetarians that consume processed meat replacements, like veggie burgers. Plant-based diets have been prescribed for decades for those with chronic kidney failure. No animal fat, no cholesterol, less acid load, and helps lower blood pressure. And indeed, if you compare the kidney function of vegans to vegetarians to omnivores, the most plant-based diet was associated with improved parameters for the prevention of degenerative kidney decline. More than 1 million new cases of skin cancer are diagnosed every year, affecting about 1 in 3 Americans within their lifetimes. The chief risk factor is UV exposure from the sun, but alcohol consumption may also play a role. Most of the cancers associated with alcohol use are in the digestive tract, though, from mouth cancer, throat cancer, stomach cancer, down to liver and colon cancer, tissues alcohol comes in more direct contact with. Why skin cancer? Well, a study of 300,000 Americans found that excessive drinking was associated with higher rates of sunburn. It may be that heavy and binge drinking are markers for an underlying willingness to disregard health risks and pass out on the beach, but maybe it's because breakdown products of alcohol in the body generate such massive numbers of free radicals that they eat up the antioxidants that protect our skin from the sun. Plants produce their own built-in protection against the oxidative damage of the sun, and we can expropriate these built-in protectors by eating those plants to function as cell protectors within our own body. One might say fruit and vegetables provide the best polypharmacy, the best drugstore against the development of cancer. The ingestion of plant foods increases the antioxidant potential of our bloodstream, which can then be deposited in our tissues and protect us against the damaging effects of the sun's rays, but only recently was it put to the test. If you take 20 women and you burn their butts with a UV lamp before and after they ate 3 tablespoons of tomato paste a day for 3 months, well, half of them did, half of them did not, there was significantly less DNA damage in the derrieres of those who had been eating the tomatoes. So 3 months before bikini season, or even just 10 weeks, if we eat lots of antioxidant-rich food like tomato sauce, we may reduce the redness of the skin burn 40%. It's like you have built-in sunscreen within your skin. Now, this isn't as good as a high SPF sunblock, but much of the UV exposure over our lifetime occurs when the skin is not protected. Thus, the use of dietary factors with sun-protecting properties might have a substantial beneficial effect. But it works both ways. Alcohol consumption decreases the protection within our skin. If you have people drink about 3 shots of vodka within 8 minutes, not 10 weeks, 8 minutes, the level of carotenoid antioxidants in their skin drops dramatically. That's how fast it can work. If, however, you drink the same amount of vodka in orange juice, there's still a drop in skin antioxidants compared to the initial value, but drinking a screwdriver is not as bad as drinking vodka straight. Now, but is the difference enough to make a difference out in the sun, though? After the drinks, they exposed the volunteers to a UV lamp and waited to see how long it would take them to burn. And the time span until they started turning red was significantly shorter after alcohol consumption than in the experiments where either no alcohol was consumed or alcohol was consumed in combination with orange juice. That's like an extra half hour out in the sun, based solely on what you put in your mouth before heading to the beach. And oranges, kind of pretty wimpy. I mean, not as bad as bananas, but berries are the best. The researchers conclude that people should be aware of the fact that the consumption of alcohol in combination with sun exposure, or a tanning booth, increases their risk of sunburn and therefore their risk of developing premature skin aging and even skin cancer. If the consumption of alcohol cannot be avoided, like if someone, I don't know, holds you down or something, then you should make sure that you have sunblock, or at least do a strawberry daiquiri or something in order to reduce oxidative damage. People with type 2 diabetes are at elevated risk for a number of serious health problems, including heart disease, premature death, blindness, kidney failure, amputations, fractures, frailty, depression, and cognitive decline. And the higher people's blood sugars are, the more heart attacks and strokes they have, the shorter their lifespans, and the higher their risk of complications like blindness and kidney failure. So a study was designed in which 10,000 diabetics were randomized into an intensive blood sugar lowering intervention, where they put people on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different classes of drugs with or without insulin to drive blood sugars down into the normal range. Of course, you're not treating the underlying cause, you're not actually treating the actual disease, but by lowering one of the effects of the disease, these high blood sugars, by any means necessary, the hope was to prevent some of the devastating complications. How'd they do? The intensive blood sugar lowering with drugs increased mortality. After reviewing mortality trends, they conclude that the harm associated with the increased risk of death outweighed any potential benefits, and they stopped the study prematurely for safety reasons. They were successful in bringing people's blood sugars down, but in trying to push people's hemoglobin A1c under 6, they ended up pushing people 6 feet under. Perhaps due to the adverse effects of the very drugs used to treat the disease. Even just injected insulin itself may promote cancer, obesity, atherosclerosis, worsen diabetic retinopathy, and accelerate aging. Insulin therapy may promote inflammation in the lining of our arteries, which may explain the results of this trial, and other trials like it that show the same thing, no reduction in these so-called macrovascular complications, heart attacks and strokes, with intensive blood sugar lowering. However, intensive therapy was associated with a 21% reduction in the development of microvascular complications like kidney dysfunction. But any such benefits should be weighed against the increased risk of dying, increased weight gain, increased risk of severe hypoglycemia in the intensively treated patients. So trying to normalize people's blood sugars with drugs might not be such a good idea. Should be noted, though, that these trials relied virtually exclusively on drugs and did not include any serious effort at diet and lifestyle change. A 2013 paper in the New England Journal of Medicine found that an intensive lifestyle intervention focusing on weight loss did not reduce the rate of cardiovascular events like heart attacks in overweight or obese adults with type 2 diabetes. It did not increase their risk of death, but it did not seem to decrease it. In fact, the trial was stopped after about 10 years on the basis of futility. I mean, they lost weight, but they weren't dying any less. And that's what we see across the board in these types of lifestyle interventions. It's good that the dietary intervention wasn't killing anyone, but why wasn't it actually helping people live longer? Because they didn't actually put them on a healthier diet. They just put them on a smaller diet, a calorie-restricted diet, meaning essentially the same lousy diet, but just in smaller portions. If we eat less and exercise more, we can lose weight, get more physically fit, slimmer, and have better blood sugar control. But if our diets continue to be so unheart healthy that our bad LDL cholesterol doesn't improve, then we're not going to be unclogging our arteries. Whereas individuals following healthier diets may experience improved reductions in blood sugar, body weight, and cardiovascular risk. Yes, by eating a smaller quantity of food without changing quality, we can lose weight, but the point of a lifestyle intervention is not to just fit people into skinnier caskets.